This is the second book in a row where a frog is abused, okay? All right, so in book 2, it picks up right where book 1 left off, where JoJo and Dio are fighting each other after Dio killed JoJo's father. There's this big battle in the mansion, and the entire mansion burns down, and then Dio escapes, and JoJo escapes, and that's where the story kind of takes off because they go in diverging paths that meet in the end. And there's more character development throughout that, which is totally different from the first book, which I actually like. And you did tell me this. You said book 1 is probably like the weakest. And now I can see where you're going with this, because this is definitely more entertaining because of all the fighting. Yeah. Whereas book 1 was just like slow character development.
I told you, I was trying to tell you, it's boring because it's setting up the characters. It's trying to show you who's going to be there.
I mean, did I really need to know who they were as children? Like, that could have just been summed up in a chapter and got immediately into the fighting. Don't get me wrong, okay? I hated this book.
What?
But it is definitely better than the first book. And it is entertaining. Hate is a strong word. I just disliked it. It's just not my thing. I could see how other weirdos might like it.
What? The fact that in the first book they talk about their childhood, that shows you the kind of connection they had and the moments they had together as adopted brothers. Because if they had just told you like, oh, they were adopted brothers and Dio tormented Jonathan his whole childhood, and then jumped right into them being teenagers or adults or whatever, I feel like it wouldn't have that same impact.
I agree. It wouldn't have had the same impact, but it's interesting that you say it wouldn't have been interesting if they had told you what was happening. You wanted to see what was happening. You know where I'm going with this, right?
Yes, I do, and
because
that's not what I said.
90% of this book is them just telling you what is happening. There is only like one chapter in here that is actually very good in showing you a character's backstory, who they are, and how they're integral to the story.
Zeppeli's backstory?
No, dear God, Zeppeli, he just tells you everything. The backstory for Jack the Ripper in this book was the best, because throughout that whole thing, they don't tell you anything. They show you everything, right? We cut to a scene where Jack the Ripper is like in an alley and he's killing some lady. Spoiler alert, you know, those history spoiler alerts, man, they get you all the time. We are shown everything and we see Jack the Ripper and it's so fascinating. And then we see Dio show up and then we see their interaction. There's some dialogue, like nothing is ever told to us. And that's what I wish this book was like throughout the whole thing. But instead, we're just told everything. And dear God, there is one scene in the beginning where Dio and JoJo are fighting and the mansion is burning down. JoJo is trying to help the Speedwagon escape. 4 different times we are told that JoJo is helping Speedwagon escape. Speedwagon says it, JoJo says it, Dio says it, and then Speedwagon says it again.
He's just grateful to be saved, okay? He's like Jonathan's fan club. Well, what else is Speedwagon supposed to do? He was living on the streets stealing stuff. He meets a really good guy, and he's like, well, maybe him and I could be friends, and we could do great things together. He saw the potential in Jonathan, and maybe took advantage of it a little bit, but he's there for Jonathan now.
Speedwagon is an interesting character just because he is, I guess, comedic relief, maybe?
Yeah, I love the different faces he makes throughout the book. He has like really silly dialogue and faces, especially his interactions with Zeppeli. I feel like him and Zeppeli have like very interesting dialogue. Speedwagon
was asking Zeppeli to teach him that Hamon thing. He was like, well, I have to punch you in the chest and maybe it'll work. And I think he does or something.
He punches him, but he like does it wrong.
So essentially just crushes his rib cage. He's like, oops, no superpowers for you, good sir. Oh yeah, and then Arena makes an appearance.
I told you she'd come
randomly.
back. I told you she would come back.
She just happens to be in the hospital where...
It's her father's hospital.
Her father owns a hospital and she's just a lowly nurse in there?
She heard that JoJo was at her father's hospital, so then she came back to take care of him.
It's interesting in that they just abandon her afterwards. Like, she just doesn't appear again. Does she appear in future books?
Yes. Oh, okay. She's in the rest of part 1 as well as part 2, and then that's it.
And then she doesn't appear ever again?
No, because we're also skipping generations here in each part.
So book 3 completes this story at least? Or
yes.
You're saying we jump ahead later on?
No, part 3 of Phantom Blood is the rest of Jonathan's story, and then part 2 is his grandson.
Oh, okay. I don't think I'm going to read that.
Why?
I'll finish this one. I will finish this trilogy, am I calling it?
I don't know.
I don't know, this first set of 3, which really should have been 1, and I feel like the first book should have really just been summarized in a few chapters, and we should have just got into the action in this one, because the action is actually really good. They're fighting a lot of different people. We're fighting some knights in here who randomly appear. We're fighting Jack the Ripper, and then there's a showdown with Dio, which is super exciting.
Okay, but here's the thing. I feel like part 2 gets a lot more interesting because you have these established characters and abilities, so it just takes those and develops them even further, and there's new characters. So instead of like these knights and Dio, it's the 3 pillar men.
I feel like it's a little too fast though. I think that Jack the Ripper was an interesting character and Zeppeli was an interesting character. And I feel like they should have spent this book introducing those 2 characters slowly, showing us what's going on rather than telling us. And I thought it would have been much more compelling to see how they were developed, their backstory, and then get them interacting in the 3rd book.
I would like to respectfully disagree with that statement because in one of your previous comments, you said that part 1 was too slow because they were showing their character development together. So if part 2 was all about Jack the Ripper and Zeppeli's character development, you probably would have been sitting here saying it's way too slow and they need to move forward already.
I can see that, all right, but maybe they didn't have to introduce so many different characters. For example, like they bring in those knights randomly and we get like 5 pages of backstory on them.
That's like the beginning of their fight. That's the last chapter.
Oh, okay. And see, that's what I kind of don't like either, is like it's not all contained in one book, so I don't really know how it ends. Just like book 1 ends and then this one picks up and tells you how book 1 ended, essentially.
But it's like that cliffhanger. It's supposed to get you to read the next book.
Oh, I guess
because then
so.
you see them like getting into position to fight, I guess, and now you're like, well, now I have to read the 3rd one because I have to see how this ends. It's like, are they gonna fight Dio? Are they gonna win? What's gonna happen?
Because it's actually interesting now. They spend like the first 3 quarters telling you nothing of interest, and then it gives you something interesting. You're like, well, now I have to buy the next one.
And if you think there's a lot of characters being introduced in this, you are in for a big surprise in the later parts because they bring in like 10, 20 characters and it's crazy.
All right, so let's talk about the abuse of frogs in this book.
To be fair, he does not hit the frog. He goes through the frog.
This is the 2nd book in a row where a frog is abused, okay? What's going on with the author and frog abuse?
Okay, maybe...
Reptile abuse.
Maybe Araki doesn't like frogs. Or, I don't know.
And the frog in here too, when he gets hit, he's like so very confused. He's like, what is happening? Did that man just punch me? No, he didn't.
He swam away just fine because Zeppeli didn't hit him. It went through him.
Zeppeli teaches JoJo this Hamon martial art.
It's the power of the sun, basically. It's
Isn't
like
that Superman's power?
I don't know what Superman's power is. It's basically just taking the power of the sun and using it in your body as your own ability. Yeah. Because Dio's now a vampire and he's like, his only weakness is the sun.
Yeah, and it has to do with some kind of like energy in your blood or something like that, which it's a fantasy. I just accepted it. I was like, whatever, sure.
Well, yeah, look at this
book.
But
they build it up to be like this ultimate weapon against Dio, and then they fight Dio, and then they realize, oh yeah, it's not that big of a deal.
I know, they fight him, they're like, oh man, we can't win this. Like, this was a big mistake.
Especially Zeppeli, right? Like, they build him up to be such like a fantastic, like, master, I guess, right? That's teaching his pupil, and he's like sending JoJo off. He's like, you got to defeat this guy. So when the showdown happens between Zeppeli and Dio, I was expecting some like high-flying action, but we don't really get that.
Well, I think it's also a way to show how strong Dio really is now, because he built up Zeppeli as like this amazing, powerful guy who had the ability of like hammering, and he was like super strong, and then Dio comes in and fights him and completely destroys him. That kind of shows how strong he really is.
I would say another interesting aspect of this book is they make some very strange sounds in here.
Yeah, the sound effects get crazy.
Like there's one, he's like, read!
Yeah.
I don't really know what like the sounds are most of the time. Yeah.
That's why watching the anime helps a lot, because they show you how to pronounce them.
They show you how to pronounce read! What? How do you say this?
Guar.
Guar. How do you say this one?
Wow.
There's one time where it's like a whole page of nothing but like sound effects.
In part 5 of JoJo, there's like a 5-page part of, I think, Giorno just screaming.
That's good. That's good storytelling right there. Come on, say it with some passion. You're falling out of a window upside down. How do you say it?
You say it.
Ree! I'd be like, Ree! That's the sound I would make if I'm falling out of a window. Ree!
He says wah like 3 times. Ooh, ooh, ooh. How do you say that?
Let's talk about the ending of this book because I feel like it's pretty epic and it's the part I like the most. He goes on to fight Dio, which we realize not as strong as he thought, but JoJo, man, there is a scene in there where JoJo intervenes in the fight between Zeppeli and Dio, where all he does is like reach his hand out and blocks, and I was like, oh my god! It was epic. It was like one of the most epic parts of both book 1 and 2. I am totally on board with reading both books just to get to that scene because I was like, oh my god, he's saving him. And with a simple like hand block too. It was pretty cool.
It shows like how strong he's getting and how cool he is.
Yeah.
He's like, he can do that?
Zeppeli spent years traveling the world, developing Hamon, and JoJo just had to like learn it over a weekend.
It was like 2 weeks, I think, when he was training, and then he was like some kind of master, like better than Zeppeli.
He bought like an online course, did some kind of like online correspondence, and then mastered this martial art of using the sun's energy to defeat zombies. I plan on reading book 3 because you're forcing me. What can I expect in book 3?
Remember the rest of it.
Is it going to be more of them just telling me what's happening, or is it going to be like some actually good storytelling?
That's like every anime, you know that, right?
I know, that's why it drives me nuts, and that's why I can't watch it. Like, let's just pretend I'm smart enough to understand what's happening, and let's move on with the story. You don't have to tell me directly 4 different times.
Hamon Overdrive.
Hamon Overdrive. Hamon in Spanish is just ham.
That's
So
not spelled like that,
in my mind, he's just saying ham all the time. He's like, ham! It's like screaming turkey before you like attack somebody. Turkey sandwich! That's what's going on in my brain.
Wow.
What's going on in yours?
I'm just, I don't know. My mind is an enigma.
You have to unlock it. It's like an ever-shifting cube that's going on in there.
Yes.
Of like some panels are like JoJo and some are like BTS and then some are like video games.
Yeah.
And they're always shifting around.
Yeah. My mind doesn't focus on one thing for too long. It's always changing.
Yeah. I believe it's called ADD.
Yeah.
You should really talk to your parents about getting some kind of medication for that.
You're my dad.
All the track stations are ready.
Dio is so pretty. Why did they draw him so pretty?
They're definitely on steroids. Like, they're taking it at minimum, like at least 3 different kinds of steroids.
Preferably in a residential area.